If you look at France, 42% turnout. National Front won 25% of the vote. Okay, that sounds amazing, and an earthquake, as it was described. But only 10% of eligible voters voted for the National Front. And it's the same with Britain. UKIP got much of the press coverage in the lead up to the election, and the results of the election were described in all kinds of earthquake terms. But again, UKIP only got 10% of the share of eligible voters in Britain. And these numbers are worth thinking about and remembering. Continuing, we have to remember that European Parliament elections are what are called second-order elections. In other words, the stakes are pretty low. There's no change of government. People don't really get engaged with European Parliament elections in much the same way as they don't get engaged with local elections. We also have to remember that these are 28 separate national elections. There is no such thing as a European Union election. In much the same way as elections in this country are really 50 state elections that add up. These are 28 separate national elections. People are going to the polls in 28 separate countries, and they're looking at 28 separate sets of interests and 28 separate agendas. So we have to remember that. Because of the second order election notion, the stakes are much lower in EP elections than they are in general elections. In general elections, there's a change of government at stake. There's no change of government at stake. There's no European president. People don't get excited about Barroso or Juncker or Van Rompuy or any of these people that nobody's ever heard of. They just don't get excited about it. So what happens is that voters that do turn out to vote tend to use European Parliament elections as a comment on the government of the day. So if they're annoyed about their national government, they will punish the national government at the EP election. If they like their national government, they will reward their national government at the EP election, although that hardly ever happens. So what usually happens is that the results of EP elections very rarely translate into significant gains for these parties at general elections. So the National Front and UKIP, for example, have done well, but they're not going to do nearly as well at the general election. In the UK, there's going to have a general election next May. I predict that UKIP is going to do pretty badly. And it may actually, ironically, get enough votes to undermine the Conservative Party, which means that there will be no referendum on UK membership of the EU. That's one of my predictions. So watch some of these spaces. Also, Seth did hint that there are different shades of Euroscepticism. Euroscepticism is not monolithic. That some people want to leave the EU altogether. Some people want it reformed. Some people don't want to be part of the Euro, but they're okay with being part of the European Union. There are multiple shades of opinion, so we've got to be careful about how we're looking at that. And leaving the EU is a minority opinion, if you look at Euroscepticism across the board. And then it's interesting to see what's happening with younger Europeans. They are leading the way to the diversification of participation. And they are turning away from elections, and they're moving to other ways of participating in the electoral process and expressing their views. So just because numbers have gone down at EP elections, that doesn't mean that they are not engaging in other ways of participating with national politics and with what's happening at the European Union level. Okay, so the conclusion of all of this is that I think that much like our midterm elections that we just had, the famous Republican rout, the result of the EP election is less significant than we're told. You have to look at all of these factors here. It really wasn't the earthquake that it was portrayed as in large parts of the media. Okay, to focus on the question of faith and trust in the EU, a lot has been said about declining faith and trust in the European Union, and the European Eurobarometer polls do tend to support this. Between 2007 and 2013, the numbers of people who don't trust the EU went from 32% to 56%. That's obviously not good news as far as Europeans are concerned. But you have to look at the fact that faith in government generally is declining. It's not just the EU, it's faith in national government. And it's even worse here. If the Europeans think they have it bad, it's much worse than the United States. When I give talks to European audiences, I say, just take a look at the United States. It's much, much worse over there. They dislike their government even more than you guys do. Only 27% of EU citizens trust their government. 32% trust the EU. Okay, that's not a huge differential, but it was bigger, and I'll show you a graph in a minute. Now, only 19% of Americans currently trust their government. So Europeans actually have a higher level of trust in government than even we do in this country. So this is worth bearing in mind. 25% of European Union citizens believe that the EU is headed in the wrong direction. 47% believe their country is headed in the wrong direction. 28% of Americans believe their country, that's wrong, is headed in the right direction. So the numbers are much worse again here than in the European Union. So the conclusion here is, I want to argue that many of the problems which are ascribed to the EU are really part of a broader set of concerns that people have with democracy. So this is a Eurobarometer poll which looks at trust in the EU. The blue line is the EU. It's gone down. And it used to be pretty high, 57%, as opposed to 41% there for national governments. The numbers for national government has also gone down, so we're now at the point where we have the 31 to 27% differential. But it has been, the gap has been much wider in the past. Looking at individual countries, again, this is the Eurobarometer polls. The people who tend to trust their government, I'm not quite sure why the Finns are so trusting in their government. They come first in that group. The EU 27%. And then when you get down to Greece, only 16%. Well, surprise, surprise. The other interesting thing about Greece is that you'll see there are no DKs in Greece. Everybody in Greece has an opinion about their government. They're either trusted or don't trust it. But you see that levels of trust in government in all of these 28 EU countries is not particularly good. Trust in government in this country, even worse. I showed this graph to my students yesterday. Back in the good old days of Eisenhower and Kennedy, look at that. We were up in the 70s there. Now we're down at 20%. And they say, well, yes, we don't trust government. You know how it is. In terms of heading in the right direction or the wrong direction, the red line there, things are going in the wrong direction for our country, whichever country it is. You'll see that the line is very high up there. In terms of the EU, there's a separate graph. It's much lower than that. So people are really concerned here about what's happening in their own countries rather than in the European Union generally. Okay. In terms of what I call the knowledge deficit, there's a lot of talk about the democratic deficit in the European Union, about the gap between the ability of ordinary Europeans to express themselves on European matters and the powers of EU institutions. I actually think that the knowledge deficit is much more important. So the gap between what the EU does and what ordinary Europeans know about what the EU does. Europeans are surprisingly badly informed about the EU. Americans are surprisingly badly informed about the American political system of government. And this has always been the case. Aristotle complained about it. Multiple people since Aristotle have complained about the uninformed voter. So this is nothing new by either time or place. The conventional view is that we don't have to worry about the uninformed voter because we can all use cues. We can listen to what political parties tell us, we can listen to what the media tell us, we can listen to what our leaders tell us, and then we can be kind of lazy voters by using their guidance to decide how to vote or how to participate. And that is the conventional view in response to this question of the uninformed voter. I reject this because I think all it does is it feeds into elitism. It encourages us to think that it's okay for elites to tell us how to vote and we just simply follow along. And I think that's wrong. In the case of the European Union, what it does is simply feed more and more into this perception that the EU is an organization that's created by elites and is maintained by elites. And this is the kind of thing that parties like UKIP love to latch on to and say these people are completely out of touch with us, that's why we need to get rid of them. The other problem with the knowledge deficit is that into this kind of vacuum of understanding, you find both the anti-EU and the pro-EU forces moving in. They misrepresent, especially the anti-EU forces. I've been following UKIP particularly closely. The kind of arguments that UKIP makes about the EU are mainly simply wrong. They misquote data, they exaggerate the effects of the EU. One thing they love to do is to talk about how much Britain is giving to the European Union budget, which is less than, it's a fraction of a percent of the total budget. Of the UK national budget. But they explode this number into 30%, 40%, ridiculous numbers like this, and people tend to believe it because they don't have any independent information to challenge the kinds of things that they're told. And in many cases, they don't really care. So they're prepared to defer to the anti-EU forces. This means that the quality of the debate about the EU has declined. It's okay to criticize something, but at least have the correct facts at hand before you do the criticism. And this is not what is happening in the case of the EU. So the debate about the EU has been distracted. This is a Eurobarometer poll, which asks Europeans how much they understand about how the EU works. And it's been pretty consistent over time. So this goes back to 2004, runs up to 2014. The blue ones are the ones that say they do understand how the EU works, and the red ones are the ones that say they don't understand how the EU works. So it hasn't really changed very much. The people who do understand the EU have taken over a little bit towards the end, and that probably is because of all of the debate that has taken place in the wake of the Euro crisis, which has actually been very helpful in terms of getting more people to talk about the EU and to get more opinions out there about how the EU works. So this knowledge deficit, I think, is extraordinarily important, but it's remarkable how little research has actually been done into it. Okay, so my conclusions. Number one, we should avoid reading too much into the results of the 2014 European Parliament elections. Number two, Euroscepticism is growing, for sure, but it is still a minority view, and there are many shades of Euroscepticism, so we have to be very careful how we think about it. Thirdly, there is declining faith in the European Union, but there is also declining faith in national government, not just in Europe, but in the United States as well. So we have to put this declining faith in the EU in the context of this general decline in faith in government in general. And then finally, it's really very hard to have a sensible discussion in the EU, especially with people like UKIP, when so few people really understand it. Just to finish up with a little story, I started a Facebook page earlier this year. It's called Keep Britain in Europe. I invite you to go and like it. When I set it up, I don't know if you've ever done a Facebook page, but there's an option, there's a profanity filter. And I set the profanity filter on the highest possible level, which means pretty much cutting everything out. So I get to see things that people post that the public doesn't get to see. And the viciousness with which people express their opinions about the EU and the kinds of things they say is really quite remarkable. And it's extremely worrying that many of these people are being led to believe the things they're being led to believe, and then are expressing themselves at the polls. With that kind of level of debate, I think the Europeans have got a real problem in terms of understanding how the EU works. And on that happy note, I will stop.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you, Seth. We can open up and have any questions for either or both of our presenters. Yeah, Bobo.
I have to run off here in just a moment, so I thought I'd go first if I can. I wonder if both of you could speak to this. You did emphasize the right-wing parties, but also on the left. To what extent does their working together in Brussels, meeting together, interacting with each other, to what extent has that strengthened their position? That is, to what extent do they learn from each other? To what extent is this just work form? What do you think?
Well, you hinted earlier that they tend not to be able to agree. And has that group that UKIP Did they not just fall apart
Well,
last week?
so I was reading about this yesterday because the first part, I thought you were going to ask if the radical left anti-Euro parties and the radical right, they're not going to get together
No.
and like that. The radical right parties also, they try to form these groups where they can learn from each other, where they can help each other. You see this across all sorts of groups where, like, the regionalists are famous for this. So the Scottish nationalists do something, like, let's say, have a referendum for independence. The Catalan learn from that, and they follow some of the same tactics and so on. The radical right parties try to form these groups, and they do so every few years. They don't last long. And I think that, as John was saying, the party group that the National Front formed fell apart. UKIP's group fell apart, but then because you have to have members from so many parties and from so many countries. And so as these parties get more Eurosceptic, some of the moderates kind of fall out, which means they lose so they can't actually coordinate, which takes away resources and all sorts of things, which you would think an anti-Europe party would not like the resources, but anyways, they really have a hard time. They struggle to get along for that reason. Even in the case of the National Front, who wants to build up these parties, the parties are also, I didn't put up anything about this, but we're trying to track information with this current survey about how much populism and charisma feeds into this, right? All of these parties, like, they have one person. Like, that's true for a lot of parties. Like, of course, everybody knows, like, the German leadership and so on. But for these radical right parties, they're often, like, one, like, strong leader, charismatic leader, and that means that when they get into a room with the other person, like Nigel Farage and Jean-Marie Le Pen or whatever, they have a hard time with each other, which makes sense.
They have one charismatic leader, and you also made the point that they don't actually have much in the way of a variety of policies. They tend to be focused single policy, single issue parties, and they rise or fall with opinion about that particular issue.
The last thing that I'll say about this, so about immigration is a good example. So domestically, the National Front goes out and talks about how they don't want immigrants. They don't want immigrants from anywhere, even Eastern Europe. But there are lots of these far-right parties in Eastern Europe that could be their allies, but then over here the National Front's talking about how bad they are. So it's hard to, that's one of the things that's hard for them, I think.
Forgive the metaphor, it seems to me that the 800-pound gorilla in the room is neoliberalism and the concentration of capital. And John, your presentation particularly made me think of this. When we talk about knowledge deficits and independent media, there aren't that many independent media outlets out there anymore. And when you go to search for them, you wind up going to the internet, you can find stuff. But then you get into situations where you have to really be a good critical reader in order to separate out the good reporting from the reporting that's biased and is manipulating statistics intentionally or unintentionally, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm asking you guys is, can we see the political discord, the polarization, and the inability for traditional parties to articulate effective messages anymore as a reflection of the concentration of capital, the lack of the trustworthy media outlets that we had in the U.S., say in the 1970s, when NBC, CBS, ABC were giving much higher quality news broadcasts, and we didn't have the cable news outlets. And is this a broader, crisis of the neoliberalization of our economies and its effect on politics?
In addition to that, I would say the whole echo chamber phenomenon is a real issue, in the sense that we actually have many more sources of information now, many of which are independent and come from all kinds of places on the ideological spectrum. But by virtue of the fact that we are suffering from information overload on both sides of the Atlantic, what people are doing is they're picking their favorite outlet and they stick with that outlet, and that outlet continues to tell them a particular story, so they're not, they don't hear the other side. So, and they become convinced by that argument. And I've been following UKIP particularly. I've been in this country for 28 years. You'd think I was finally become an American. But UKIP fascinates and worries me and kind of depresses me, but UKIP is supported by a particular branch of the media in Britain, so like the Sun newspaper, for example, and the Daily Mail. Well, they're all tabloids now, but these were kind of the original tabloids. And they make the same arguments, the same anti-European Union arguments, and the kind of people that get their information from them have all of their views, first of all, developed and then confirmed. And the kind of people that read those papers, to the extent that anybody does read a paper anymore, don't really hear what the other side has to say. They don't read The Guardian or The Independent or The Times. And that's the real problem, is the echo chamber phenomenon, I think.
I think one of the things that your comment brought up to me is John's point about alternative forms of participation. I think what's good about the current media environment is that parties like Podemos in Spain, they don't need the mainstream media to care about them. They have, I think after starting, they had 100,000 Facebook, going back to the Facebook group, they had 100,000 Facebook group members within a month. They have 400,000 by now. They want to get their message out. They don't need that. So that's part of it. It's just like the people who want the protest, and Beppe Grillo in Italy does some of the same stuff. He's fighting against, I mean in Italy he has to fight against Berlusconi's media.
Because he gets a
right?
lot of media attention regardless.
Yeah, and so, but I think your other point is something that concerns me, is that the traditional parties have a really hard time articulating their message. So it does concern me if the Conservatives do win and they do have a referendum, right? There's multiple big ifs in between it. Let's say they do have a referendum. Even if they come out for staying in the EU, I have no faith in their ability to articulate a message that is positive and compelling and educational. They couldn't really do that to keep Scotland in a few months ago. They really struggled to articulate a message about why Scotland should stay in, and that's a pretty easy message. Credit the EU.
Well, the question is, how much of that is because the mechanisms of the EU were hijacked by neoliberal interests at its inception?
I think, well, I mean, there's two parts to that. So the first part is, I think the parties have become bad at articulating their message about lots of things, including the EU, and that it shows up every time there's a referendum. I think the neoliberalism plays out as these parties are protesting, and they're protesting from that idea, either from the right or the left. So the Podemos or the Beppe Grillo or whatever, they're both protesting about these neoliberal policies being put down on them from Germany. And I think even if you want to take a more optimistic view than you do, like say that these are the right policies, right? They're not doing a good job articulating why they're right or why they're good economic policies. So the fact that they're also not working so well, it's obvious. Like if you're 50% unemployment in youth, 50% youth unemployment in Spain, and people are saying, yeah, let's deregulate more. It's like, well, tell me how that's going to help me. I think they could articulate a message like that, but I don't think they do. I think you're right.
Sorry, certainly the EU is seen, as I mentioned earlier, has always been seen to be elitist, as a construct of elites. You know, it's not elected, therefore it's undemocratic, even though it's not. I think of the EU as a confederal system, and therefore, essentially, it's not undemocratic because it actually functions like all confederal systems in history, the few have ever functioned. It's not a federal Europe, but it's criticized as if it is. So, you know, we can't. The European Parliament elections, that's all we have. We can't elect the president of the Commission. We can't elect this person, that person. And therefore it's elitist, and therefore that rings true. So whether it's been hijacked or not, it's perceived to have been always a construct of elites, and that's where a lot of this populist anti-European sentiment really kind of builds on that.
So, do you comment?
I was wondering if you were to give us a big picture of Europe and to see where the modest growth in Euroscepticism comes from. If you look at all the countries, what would you see? Do you see that it seems to me that it's happening where it is happening and it's being overstated, but is it happening where economically people are doing better than as opposed to the countries? Because even in Spain, the Euroscepticism is coming apparently more from the left, right? So where do you see, what are the differences between the countries that are struggling economically in the European Union, the more marginal, smaller countries, the weaker ones, versus the ones that are doing better off, in terms of, is there a different story in the slight rise of Euroscepticism between those two categories?
It's a good question. I think, I don't think there is an obvious, I think the pattern that I would expect is that the places that were hit hardest by the crisis, that were most, that had the policies most forced upon them, would be the places most eager to dislike it. So Spain, Italy, Greece, Portugal, Ireland. But that's not really what you find.
Right, they don't have these strong parties that are...
Right. And so the most Eurosceptic places are places that I don't even know that I would know what's going on. Like Latvia has extremely strong feelings of Euroscepticism. They don't have a big party or anything, but they're right there with the UK in terms of like, in Estonia, I think. In the Monkey Cage, which is a great blog at the Washington Post, Casmuda had a graph showing like as unemployment gets higher, there's no relationship with Euroscepticism, which is exactly what you would expect if it's about the crisis. It's not really. That's just part of it. I think it gets back to John's point about the EU is an easy target for populists because they're over there, they're bad, people don't know what they do, so they're easy to blame for every sort of ill that sets upon you. So in some countries, like France and the UK, the populists target the EU. In other places like Greece, they target the EU, but they're also targeting like everybody else. They're just kind of a general outlash against the EU, elites, immigrants, everybody, blaming everybody because there's a lot of problems.
I wish I'd got the graph that showed levels of trust in the EU rather than in the national government there. But you can, I mean, I think, the thing about Euroscepticism, not only does it come from different backgrounds and have different goals, but it varies by time and place. So Eastern European skepticism, Euroscepticism, has different motivations than Western Europeans. But I think some of the countries that did worse than the Eurozone crisis, or in the recent economic downturn, are down towards the end there. So, I mean, Greece, for example, it's easy to point out Greece, especially since I do like the fact that there are no don't knows in Greece. Everybody has an opinion. I do like that one. Portugal is down there, but France. I mean, France has been one of the leaders of European integration right from the beginning, and it's right down there with that group of countries. And then, sorry, I can't see Ireland. Where is it?
22%.
Okay, so, and again, this is faith in the trust in the country rather than the EU, but there is a little bit of a relationship between that. So there's patterns, but there are different causes for those patterns.
Probably don't have time soon, but I want to take kind of a devil's advocate position or try to be a little more of a hand-wringer here. I mean, so one of the arguments is that, that you can show about maybe this Euroscepticism is overblown is by showing, well, look, if you do the kind of math you were doing, John, and saying 6% of all voters really chose these parties, and if turnout was 100%, it would probably be a percent or something, right? But that doesn't reflect at all about what the other parties we haven't decided to label as Eurosceptic are saying, and if their message is changing at all, right? So you can't just suggest that a party is saying the same things it did about liking Europe back in 1980 as it's saying about Europe in 2014. And I don't know if Seth's data can say, oh yes, you can actually say that, but I wonder if the quote-unquote mainstream parties are changing and seeing, well, we can gain votes by becoming more Eurosceptic. And that'll sort of, so look, what I'm trying to say is maybe just looking at sheer electoral strength is not going, it's going to understate the growth in Euroscepticism. That's sort of my one counterpoint. And another one is this idea that John said, which I agree with, it turns out that European Parliament elections are not very good predictors of national level election results. That's true, but by strengthening the power of the EP, one can make the argument that we should expect that this bad predictor may become a little bit better predictor with time, right? I mean, so far this hasn't panned out, but now with the connection between the Commission and the European Parliament, with the President, maybe we ought to see a somewhat tighter connection between the next rounds of national elections. So I think, I don't know if you want to respond to either of those points, or if you think there might be a kernel of concern here if you look at some of those sorts of things. I basically agree with your points, but I'm just trying to head to the other direction a little bit.
No, I think so. Kind of combining those 2 points. So let's just talk France. So the National Front used to be kind of one of these protest, unrealistic parties. People would vote.